So we're going to have you, I'm sure by now you guys are familiar with this, you were looking forward to it. We're going to scan the QR code for you to engage in your PD day. The QR code will take you to your form, our red, yellow, and green check marks. Green check marks are things you understand, things you get, things you can implement, that you can work with, that you understand. Yellow are those concepts or ideas that you're not quite sure about. You maybe want to check that with someone else. Can we have a little bit more conversation about this? Red are the full stop, don't understand it, go back to beginning, do not pass go, do not collect $200 concepts. We are asking that you complete this, at least one red, yellow, green, for each session. So you'll do it 4 times. So we're gonna start with our keynote, and you'll do your red, yellow, green for the keynote, and then you'll do it again at the end of each of your breakout sessions. I'm gonna take a moment so everyone can scan the QR code. I suggest that when you scan it that you bookmark that page so that you can come back to it throughout the day. And it's in Slack because Kelsey's amazing. When all else fails, check Slack, right? There are seats up front if you're looking for a seat and a table. These people up front look like they are pleasant and they would love to engage in conversation with you all. Maybe not, they're snickering at me. So we're gonna start, we have a keynote today with the fabulously wonderful Dr. Cynthia Dillard. Her keynote session is When We Remember the Importance of the Spirit of Our Work in Education. And I gave a lot of thought on how to introduce this person, and nothing felt sufficient. So I will tell you what I can, and the rest you are gonna learn through the keynote. She does it all. She is an educator, a scholar, a leader, a writer, an author, a philanthropist. She's at the Seattle University. She also works to provide education to high-need areas, specifically working in Ghana. She brings to this idea of how we bring ourselves and our ancestors and our history to our work, and it's a phenomenally impactful way to think about the work we do and how we help our students and also help ourselves and those future generations. I can't do it justice, but it is a privilege and an honor to introduce Dr. Cynthia Dillard to you as your keynote speaker today.
That was beautiful. That was beautiful. That was gorgeous. Wow. Just simply wow. This looks like it might be a little bit of a hard crowd. Not sure if it's Saturday morning or what's happening, but we'll have fun, or at least I will, during these next few minutes. The idea here for me is that I'll spend 30 minutes or so talking about some stuff, and then we'll spend some time sort of regurgitating and thinking through some of those ideas. But I need to say thank you to a few folks before I go any farther. And the first entity that I need to say thank you to is the Creator. Because I got woke up this morning because I still have work to do. And that is the way that the day starts for me every day. So I first want to thank the Creator. I certainly want to thank Morgan for that beautiful introduction. Sometimes I think people get overwhelmed by the volume of work, but it really is about how the work connects to you. So I appreciate the words, the kind words. I want to thank Dr. Varner, who's not here today. Kenny Varner, many of you know him. Kenny was one of my students at Ohio State. He was a student once. He was one of my students at Ohio State, and I have followed his career and his ascent since then, and am very proud of the work that he's doing here at UNLV that involves so many incredible educators like yourself. I appreciate, too, the foresight in gathering folks together like this as a key starting point for what we mean by educational justice, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And probably the most important thank you I need to say today is to all of you. You know, a long time ago when I was in graduate school, there was a little tiny pink book by an author called Herbert Cole. And Herbert Cole talked a little bit about how we always have the choice to learn. It's never just, we're going to learn. No, we're choosing to learn. Your students are choosing to learn. And so I want to thank you for choosing to gather today, for the powerful energy that you have in the room, and for the powerful energy that you will engage all throughout the day. I think all of us live the Black lives that are too often rendered invisible, many of us, but that can help us all, as Alice Walker says, find the work that our souls must do. I also am totally enamored with anybody who can live in Las Vegas. Because I don't know, this water thing, I feel like a raisin. I can't get enough water. So if I'm chugging this, it's not because there's some sort of really weird thing wrong with me. It's because I really literally cannot get enough water. So I hope that whoever's in charge will make sure that the water keeps coming. All right. So this is a talk about remembering, and I want to sort of focus it on this idea of being joyful in the work of teaching, learning, and living. And I think being joyful depends on who you ask. Often as students, staff, and faculty, our first thought focuses on pursuits of our minds, on high achievement for our students, in being successful, or on doing well. But too often missing is the attention to what animates us in this work, the spirit of our work. In the short time with you today, I want to explore the essential role of spirit in education, something we don't talk about too often because we're often confusing it with religiosity. But I want to talk about the spirit of our work, and very particularly about how acts of remembering can be the spirit and commitment to being whole and being well in this work. This talk draws from my most recent book, The Spirit of Our Work, Black Women Teachers Remember. It was published by Beacon Press about 1.5 years ago. This work is based on a 7-year study of Black women teachers in our Ghana Study Abroad in Education program that I ran for a number of years while I was at the University of Georgia. And the joy and the healing that these educators experienced through what I have theorized as processes of remembering Black culture, Black heritage, and the like. This talk, what you'll hear today, is really a bit of an overview of this book. So, and I guess in some ways a shameless plug, because it's a book that I think is important for folks to read. Because all too often we forget that remembering is the stuff that we're doing every day, all day. And that it's work that our children also need to be engaging in. So I'm going to try to make this clicker thing work, but I don't see a clicker thing. You got it? Okay, slide 1. So remembering as a concept is based on the idea that all peoples have ways of being. Everybody has ways of being and knowing and doing that are valuable, necessary. But because of empire building, because of white supremacy, and other sorts of structures of oppression that have often dehumanized and distorted folks, we don't often sort of think about what it means to engage the histories that we come from. So in my mind, we're required, as teachers especially, to remember. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. That is to both recall, call again, and also to remember or to gather and put ourselves back together with our truer stories, our truer beliefs, our truer knowings. And everybody, although this book is about Black women teachers, everybody in this room, all teachers, are being asked to remember in this moment, given the lies that we've been told about the various lives and cultures that we've lived in order to understand how we've arrived, for example, at the challenges, tragedies, and traumas of the past few years of racial injustice and the continuation of racial injustice amidst a whole global pandemic. In plain sight, we see again that the negative outcomes always fall disproportionately on the backs and bodies of Black and brown people and other people of color. And while Black women are not the only people who engage in remembering, we do embody multiple intersectional and cultural identities that educational professionals need to know and learn from. Exploring the power and humanity of Black women as we articulate the conditions required for healing and joy today. My hope is that all gathered will be inspired toward the important work of remembering that you may need to do in order to be the teachers and educational professionals whom Black students deserve and whom all students need. But whether we are speaking of healing or joy, of equity or justice, the road begins with looking back to look forward. It begins with remembering. So let's start with some basic definitions of what I mean by remembering. I use the re, that is putting the prefix re in parentheses, as a way of signifying that Black people have always been brilliant creators of life and knowledge. So our task is to act like we know that. To remember is to both recall and to gather, and to put back together our truer stories, our truer brilliances, our truer knowings. And it includes 5 processes. Slide 3. So these are not linear processes. These are just parts of remembering. And those of you who teach in classrooms with kids, which is most everyone in this room, you know, this idea of remembering is something that many of us are already engaged in. But it's something that I think would really sort of shift the curriculum in the room to allow the kinds of stories that exist there in the bodies and lives of your children to be present. So first, remembering includes researching. Researching involves an intentional search, right? An intentional seeking, an intentional looking, an intentional search for something about Black heritage and or culture that we believe will teach us something new, right? In this search, we're also open to the possibility that we might be changed in the process. But whatever we're searching for within Black identity and culture, we hope that it also helps us to see ourselves, again, across race, more clearly as teachers and humans. So that's one part of remembering. Another part of remembering is revisioning. Revisioning, those of you who are doctoral students in the room, this is something that we're constantly asking you to do. Revising. Those of you who are curriculum people, working on curriculum for classrooms, we are also constantly being asked to revise. But what does it mean to revise? It actually is about having a new vision for the kind of curriculum that you think would help your children to be able to know themselves and others better. So this kind of revisioning, as a part of remembering, involves an expansion of our current worldview of Black people, culture, and knowledge beyond solely what we can see. You know, in academia, in higher ed, in knowledge bases in schools, we often focus on what's up here to the detriment of what's in here. You know, what's the heart work? What's the soul work? What's the vision that needs to change there too? Whatever we're whatever we're revisioning is something that also has to bring us a new world sense. So it isn't just about our heads, it's about our hearts as well. It's about new ways of thinking, feeling, touching, seeing, hearing, new ways of making sense of the evidence that we maybe can't see, the spiritual connection for children and for ourselves. Recognizing, or what we often say as recognizing, involves the work of changing our thinking and our minds about who Black people are, what Black people have accomplished, and the cultural and social brilliance of Black folks, not just on this side of the water, but from the African continent to the diaspora and all parts in between. While recognizing or recognizing, changing the mind, is often manifest in a change in our minds, it also involves a shift in our hearts. Representing or representing involves literally putting ourselves and our understandings of Black identities, notions of Black womanhood and culture into the world in new and fuller ways. These acts of representing can be understood as a kind of truth-telling or a reckoning of righting some historical wrongs. So many of you who are already engaged in this process of trying to tell the correct stories, more authentic stories, truer stories of what you know to be right about students in your classrooms, that's the work that you're doing. It's a kind of remembering that shows up as representing the curriculum in new and different ways. And then finally, reclaiming, which involves going back and forward to lay claim about the legacy of Black and African people and to take your place within or in relationship to this legacy. Engaging in an education that remembers involves intention. Like, it's not going to just happen. These structures, we were talking about it last night, structures of education were designed for a whole lot of folks not to be a part of them. And so something that we do within them has to be very intentional. And what I'm calling for here in this idea of remembering is that we intentionally remember, intentionally bring new stories, intentionally do different kinds of work in the context of curriculum and teaching and relationships with families. Ayikwe Arma, the great Ghanaian writer, and I'm going to be saying a lot of different words and people's names and stuff. This is like my call to action in some ways too, that these are probably texts that you may or may not have read, and they might be worthy of a read. They might be worthy for some of you junior high school and high school teachers, students to read. But there's a brilliant Ghanaian author called Ayikwe Arma. You'll see his name on the next slide. But he said something that I thought was really important about the history of African people when he said this, the fourth slide. He says, we are not a people of yesterday. And if we look at our kids and we see today, right? But these kids are not people of today. They are people of yesterday. They live within a history that is longer than their 5 years, or their 7 years, or their 12 years, right? So we are not a people of yesterday. Do they not ask how many single seasons we have flowed from our beginnings until now? We shall point them to the proper beginnings of their counting. That's what remembering does. The air everywhere is poisoned with the truncated tales of our origins. That is also part of the wreckage of our people. What has been cast abroad is not a thousandth of our history, even if the quality were true. But the haze of this fouled world exists to wipe out knowledge of our way. Too often in the study of teaching and teacher education, we approach our discussions and research about race, about gender, about education from the place where it is presumed that Black people just happened to be in the Americas. We just happened to be enslaved. Just happened to have suffered more than 400 years of degradation and inequities. We speak and act as if these traumatic conditions occurred to an entire race of people and continue to occur, without regard to the consequences and effects that such a legacy has on a people, particularly in relation to teaching, learning, and education. By extension, those same narratives imply that it was simply an unfortunate set of circumstances that just happened in the United States of America, instead of a systematic, global structuring of privileges for some and marginalization for others. Conditions that have created what Derek Bell calls the permanence of racism, racial injustice, and racial inequities worldwide. We need only look at the recent uprisings in the streets across the US that continue today and the world to be reminded of Black people's continued and persistent resistance and revolution in the face of oppression. We deserve freedom. That insistence of our humanity is in our DNA. Now, the impacts of racism and racial inequities on Black women are too often an invisible part of this legacy of oppression, especially in the literature on Black teachers' lives and experiences. Go and search about Black women teachers, like studies of Black women teachers. You'll find just a handful. And many of them are pretty old, but you'll find just a handful of studies. This is the invisibility that must be addressed, in my view. There is a different way to think about the presence and work of teaching for justice and teaching for equity. Another slide. We can center that conversation about equity and justice education in the spirit of Black women teachers who have thrived and loved in spite of unmentionable and multiple oppression. Black women have always marshaled and remembered the legacy of Black people in relation to our spirits, and those rememberings have required us to lean on that substance of things unseen, on our spirituality. And what scholarship has implicitly told us, and what I've been working over the course of a career to lift up, is that in order to face adversity, and I'm speaking to you, everybody here, in order to face adversity, oppression, exclusions, and remain insistent and steadfast in one's right to exist and to be, it is often our spiritual lives that have supported and affirmed and continue to support and affirm, no matter what we call them, culturally relevant and sustaining practices in educational spaces where Black students and their teachers live. Another slide. Spirituality here, in my definition, again, different from religiosity, is defined as being conscious of and paying attention to the order, power, and unity that flows through all of life and that encompasses an energy and responsibility greater than ourselves. For Black women, often there are three dimensions of spirituality that author Akasha Hull defines this way. She says that in order to talk about spirituality, we are really talking about, 1, our politics, 2, our spiritual consciousness, and 3, our creativity. So 1, spirituality is also about using it to address, break down, and work to abolish structures and conditions that hamper liberation and freedom for everybody. Such labor requires great creative force and great energy. And speaking directly to the Black women in the audience here today, it requires us as Black women teachers, not alone, but it does require that we remember who we are and our history, culture, and contributions in ways that take into account the long history of Black life, resistance, knowledge, and culture. Our work as Black women teachers has been and continues to be about attending to the spirit of those whom we teach, and at the same time about talking back, like Bell Hooks talks about it, talking back to systems that continue to oppress. But undergirding this labor, and many of you understand this labor, and often in hostile climates, I heard about a few of those last night, we must also remember who we are and whose we are in order to create more humane conditions in schools and university communities. And when Black women, I think, are able and willing to marshal our spirits in pursuit of teaching and learning, everything we touch can be transformed, including our students, all of our students' lives. So in the spirit of the wise stories that many of us heard as children at the feet of our elders or ancestors in our versions of a village, like those stories we heard from older kids on our block that helped us navigate our way through, or at the knees of our mothers as they braided our hair, I share with you all this collective story of how remembering is the spirituality of Black women who teach. My hope is that today you too, again, regardless of what identity positions you live within, that you might be moved to remember to call your very life back to yourself on behalf of the demands of the day, on behalf of Black education, on behalf of the liberation and freedom of Black people everywhere. But to do so, all of us are going to have to learn to remember the things we have learned to forget. That is the remembering that we all need in order to get free. Now, given the dearth of literature on Black women teachers, it's the stories of Black women educators that I highlight in the book, The Spirit of Our Work. The stories of teachers, of higher ed professionals, of school leaders, of preschool teachers, of teacher educators who engaged in processes of remembering both the length and the breadth of Black life from Ghana, West Africa, to Americas, and sometimes back again. For a scant few participants, our trip simply added the stamps to their well-used passports. For some, our trip was the first time some had had a passport, or in a few cases, the first time a few of them had flown on a plane. While all participants were moved, there was something absolutely transformational when the Black women educators, next slide, touched down in Ghana. It was something about the way it felt like home and not home at the same time, in the way that we immediately felt connections that we didn't expect to feel. We saw our own aunties and uncles' faces in those of Ghanaians walking down the street. Another slide. We ate familiar foods in new ways. We could see the gumbo that we knew in the okra stew that we ate there. Another slide. We saw sisters in their Sunday best, slaying as they engaged in their own version of a church strut that we knew so well. As Tom Feelings wrote in his powerful children's book, I Saw Your Face, there was something about the influence and impact of accurately remembering pieces of yourself and your relations that transformed our bodies, minds, and spirits. As one participant described, another slide, it literally shifted the molecules in me. Being on the continent of Africa opened space and time for Black American women teachers to know and embrace their spirituality as the common life-affirming core that runs through all facets of Black identity, through our bodies, minds, and spirits. We found in Ghana a place to situate ourselves as Black women teachers at our origins and to follow the roots, R-O-U-T-E-S, and routes, twists and turns of the Black people we had become in the United States and beyond. We reveled in the ways that our bodies, minds, and spirits just felt lighter in the fact that there was a place in the world where we could breathe a bit more deeply. This lightness of being, this little bit of freedom from the weight of racism that we carry heavy in the U.S., felt like balm to our souls. Remembering the beauty and power of Ghana quite literally transformed our visions of ourselves and our work as Black women educators into clearer versions of ourselves and clearer visions of our work. Being in Ghana helped each of us to actually feel and find something that the late Ntozake Shange suggests is at the very core of a spiritual life, regardless of the name that you call spirit. She said, I found God in myself, and I loved her. I loved her fiercely. At what James Baldwin calls a merciful distance from the U.S., we learned about our Americanness through the paradoxes we experienced on Ghanaian soil. We learned to feel and trust our African rhythms, the cultural memories buried deep down in our DNA, in the sometimes overwhelming presence of economic poverty. We wrestled with the ways that worldwide systems of white supremacy, patriarchy, and economic domination manifest in ways similar and different in Africa and in America, but always inextricably connected. We stood witness to the horrors experienced by our ancestors. Traveled the same paths in our bus that they traversed in shackles. We stood on their remains in those dark dungeons where they died and survived in ways that forever changed the circumstances for African people on both sides of the water and quite literally created us as African or Black Americans. We quite literally stood on the shoulders of our ancestors. Now, this was not an easy walk. And all too often in education, I think we want everything to be easy and fun. But where our deepest learning happens is usually in those moments where it's hard, where it's a struggle. It was not an uncomplicated walk. We struggled with the lies and the shame of the stories we had been told, and the lies and the shame that we had internalized as Black women. We were overwhelmed by perpetual waves of mourning, our relations and ancestors that mirrored the ocean waves of this coastal country, the watery graves for so many who had come before us. And we experienced and learned through ways small and large the ecstatic joy and our amazing grace as we met and talked and experienced what Ghana was to us and what we were to Ghana. And we were not always alone in our journey because we could feel our legacies, feel our lineages. We took every step with the Creator and all of the ancestors who had walked before us, with those who will walk after us. We remembered. And when Black women teachers remember, everything is possible. But hear me clearly. Next slide. If justice and equity and healing are key in education, and I think they are, remembering cannot be optional for any of us. In capitalistic, patriarchal, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, let's keep going, spaces like the US, interlocking systems of oppression do to Black people what they do to every people who do not have spaces to remember their longer histories on these shores. They trap us exactly where we are, where others want us to be, in the place of knowing only what others want us to know. They ensure that Black people are doomed to repeat the cycles of harm and limits that have been rained upon us. But they also trap those who are determined to maintain that very status quo and make them less fully human as well. They just don't know it. While Black people have definitely experienced the deep sense of loss, we are not lost. And I argue that for just about every people in this country. We are not lost. And as we remember our way, we have the opportunity to move into the greatness of our being on our terms. This is the recognition or the recognition that must find its way to the center of education for Black people on these shores as teachers and as students. It is the kind of remembering that expands us, it makes us bigger, that moves us to become more fully human in the face of the inhumanity that we face. And in schools sometimes can be a bit inhumane. In places that still see and treat what Du Bois and Tina Love call dark people as less than human. That is our work and must be our walk out here in this African diaspora. But it must also be the work and walk of those who love us. Such remembering pushes us to answer the question that the phenomenal writer Toni Cade Bambara asked us years ago in her book called The Salt Eaters, and to truly hear their response about the meanings of our road to wholeness as a people when she asked this question. And I'm asking this question of you all as teachers. Are you sure, sweetheart, that you want to be well? I like to caution folks, that's all. There's a lot of weight when you're well, just so you're sure and ready to be healed, because wholeness is no trifling matter. A lot of weight when you are well. Through Bambara's voice, the question of being well in our spirit and seeking our wholeness are made more important to consider for all of us who teach Black students. A lot of weight when you are well. It also means that we say yes to remembering the wisdom, history, and culture of Black people that we may not even know that we needed, particularly given that many of our own educational journeys were post-integration, and as such, were never really intended to center Black lives and story in the first place. It means we must stand firmly in our wisdom and what we know to be truth, even as the world may tell us otherwise. It means we must honor the covenants we have with the ancestors and with our traditions and stories that did not begin on these shores, but have continued through us. I think I missed a slide, but that's all good. Thinking about spirit and spirituality and wholeness is nothing short of radical in education. It's not something that you'll see coming up in your curriculum meetings or in your IEP meetings or meetings with your supervisors. And I work with teachers. I'm in teacher education, so it is especially radical to talk about wholeness and spirituality and spirit in teacher education. But frankly, Black wellness, wholeness, and freedom are the only goals of an education that are worthy of Black people. And we can say the same thing about all people. Remembering honors the complexity of the wholeness in the long history of Black life. That is where our playbook for today resides. Next slide. I think I'm a slide. Oh, yeah, great. And while that gestures towards our arrival over 400 years ago, when 20 and odd enslaved African people were brought to Port Comfort, Virginia, our spirits and our stories as Black people began long before that moment. They began in our villages and home places in Africa. And our way to wholeness and diaspora begins by turning those slave ships all the way around and returning to where we began, even if not literally, figuratively. This return is about the journey back to ourselves, to that place where we first were known and were first loved, where the arms that hold us still. What I have come to know as a researcher, next slide, when our collective story as Black people begins on the continent where our ancestors were born, a profound healing begins there for us too. We find space to reject the lies and untruths that we've been told and that have been taught to us for centuries about who we are. We can lay those burdens of racism, of sexism down and name our pain and suffering as well as our joy and triumphs. We replace what's in our mind and hearts about who we are by affirming our humanity and our spirits against a backdrop where, as Audre Lorde says, I feel, therefore I can be free. Like our African ancestors, we can begin to create ourselves as Black women who know that we are their wildest dreams. In a recent dissertation proposal, it was last year at this time, proposal meeting of a Black woman alumni of this same program that I'm describing, I learned yet another lesson from her. I asked the student, let's call her Rita, to share a bit more about the criteria she was using to select participants for her study. She talked through the criteria and at the very end shared a question that has stayed with me since. She said she selects her participants based on a simple question. Next slide. Who has more of the story to tell? And in a commitment to remembering that person with more of the story to tell begins with you. Every human being has heritage and cultural knowledge inside of them. We use it every day in every decision that we make as teachers, principals, leaders. And not all of it is something to be proud of. Some of those memories and ways of being are painful. Others are joyful. Sometimes they scare us, making us afraid to explore what's really inside of us. But how can we teach if we do not know what has brought us to this place? The stories of our ancestors' movements and migrations, how we came to be who we are, and the legacy of all of those things we embody. To seek justice and equity in education is to lay those wounds and triumphs bare, the ones inside of us and those of our ancestors. Because our healing, both of ourselves and of education, frankly, is right next to those wounds. As individuals, as collectives, and certainly in the systems of education where we work. And until we can remember and cry for the legacy of inequities and harm caused to Black people and other folks, name that harm and actively work to repair it, we will never be whole, never be, regardless of the new models of teaching and learning that we bring into practice in our schools. And as teachers, our spirits will never be well enough, as Bambara asks us, to teach all of our students. Today, as often is the case, I have explicitly focused my attention on Black women teachers. But if you listen deeply and want to learn from the power and humanity of Black women, you will find lessons that all of us need to know to be the teachers that Black students deserve and that all students need. Next slide. First, next slide. Okay, thank you. First, Black women offer you the invitation we offer you the invitation to remember. That is the first lesson. And that is the invitation that you must also be able to offer to your own students. So before you plan a lesson, develop any curriculum or syllabus, as their teacher, your inner life needs to be also well. As the person responsible for your students' well-being and their wholeness in mind, body, and spirit, you too must be working towards wholeness. Not perfect, but having spent considerable time in reflection, careful study, and examination of your spirit, your knowledge, the knowledge that animates, the children that you teach and the values embedded within that. Oh, I'm missing a page here. Hang on. There we go. So what do we know about the long traditions of the people, of the students in your classroom? Like the Hippocratic Oath, where medical doctors pledge first to do no harm, we must know who Black people are, lest we unknowingly do harm to Black children in their educational experience. So before you begin to teach Black students, you might start by asking yourself a few questions. And I offer these up not as the questions, but as possibilities for some questions that might need to be asked. Number one, this is the next slide. When I think of my close friends and colleagues, are there Black women or Black people in this group? Why or why not? Have I ever talked about our racial differences and really listened to what they were telling me? If I'm a white person in this relationship, is there a knot in my gut as I talk about Blackness and Black people? And how did it get there? How do I describe that knot to other people? And how does the act of doing so enable a productive dialogue with others, particularly across differences? What is my life experience with Black women or Black people, not just in the US, but across the globe? Again, our history didn't start just in this place. So how do we learn those longer histories and broader histories of Black life? What additional experiences might I need to have in order to understand Black life more fully? And how do I reasonably and respectfully have those necessary experiences? Again, offered up just as possibilities. Remember, this isn't an exhaustive, there we go, but simply offered as an invitation to begin to tap into your own spirit as a necessary first step to your teaching. It's also an invitation that is given to all teachers of all racial, ethnic, and social identities, an invitation to do the courageous and important work of looking at yourself and what you know before you grab onto the brilliant curricular frameworks in Black traditions like, next slide, Ghulam Muhammad's Cultivating Genius. Next slide. Oh, my bad. I used to have a slide in there. And it had books like, is it there? Oh, yay, okay. Cultivating Genius. And Dr. Muhammad has a brand new book out called Unearthing Joy that is incredible, that talks about the role of joy in education. Gloria Ladson-Billings' stellar ongoing text, The Dream Keepers. Django Paris, her student, and Sammy Alim's book on culturally sustaining pedagogies. You all had Rich Milner here last fall and his work on starting where you are, but don't stay there. I'm saying those are incredible texts, but I'm saying there's some work that teachers need to do with and for themselves prior to engaging those texts, right? That's what Black women know. Secondly, I think Black women offer you, and this is the next slide, the power of sanctuary, something I hope that you might think about in terms of offering it to your students. While this talk rests on Black women's rememberings of roots of African American culture and traditions in the sanctuary that Ghana was for us, generations of our grandmothers and aunties have left us a plethora of texts that provide glimpses into the various sanctuaries that Black women have created and experienced in this long walk to freedom. Authors like Abena Busia, Alice Walker, whom many of you have heard of, Toni Morrison, Paula Marshall, Maya Angelou, Niara Waheed, Lucille Clifton, the poet, have been sanctuary for me, providing models of how to breathe and how to resist oppression and to build on behalf of freedom as Black women. They have been hush harbors in the harshness of a world that too often renders us invisible. But remember, in addition to being a refuge or a quiet place for our minds, bodies, and spirits, enslaved Black people saw hush harbors or used hush harbors, created hush harbors as spaces where we remembered who we were and whose we were in those spaces. We found joy and purpose in remembering. Rituals of praise and song and dance and prayer. It was a place where we were affirmed in community with other Black people, and we also communed with the spirits of our ancestors. It was a space where our bruised and wounded souls could be healed in a world that embraced Black humanity, and that space could be created again and again. Those spaces, whether through literature, gatherings, or in spaces of contemplation, are how we remember Black humanity when the hurt and the hate is too much. We know inside, deep inside, that our Black lives matter. What we need in schools and educational spaces and our tasks are to create some modern day hush harbors for our babies, spaces of remembering that also know that same truth. If as a teacher you will join in the struggle for education and freedom that creates a sanctuary for Black students and communities, please know that the struggle that you are joining did not start today. You will need to make a serious and ongoing commitment to critically studying and unpacking the length of that hurt and harm and danger that you may have endured, and in other cases that you may have caused or benefited from. As a teacher, you will need your own sanctuary. Last night we were laughing because there was a whole bunch of folks gathered together, and they figured out that they needed their own sanctuary to make sense of their own work, leaning on no one to teach you what you do not know as a shortcut to the gift that critical studying and remembering can be for your spiritual and intellectual growth. That is the gift of sanctuary. It's a place where you can search again, vision again, think again, present yourself again, and ultimately claim and live legacy again. Who is a part of that sanctuary will be up to you. You will need to figure that part out. Your sacred community. It will vary from person to person, but you will need groups of people around you, a community to help you in your work of unlearning and in some cases learning again the history of these people. That's just fine. That's the work that there is to do. I offer up a couple of questions or a few questions that you might do in that sanctuary. In the next slide. So how do I hold some questions you might sort of think about in your community? How do I hold differences in the stories I'm reading or experiences that I'm having with Blackness sacredly, which means with reference, without judgment or denial? That's often the case when we raise stories, right? Did that really happen? Was it really that bad? I think it's important that we have spaces where we can just have folks bearing witness, right? Can I rest in that place in these experiences where it's not always about me, not about what I know or feel, but empathetic enough to imagine a different reality? Are humility, sacrifice, and selflessness at the center of my desire to know Black stories, Black culture, or Black people, or am I collecting exotic stories to tell? And many of us have had painful experiences with folks appropriating stories that were not for public consumption, but were really about our healing. And so how do we hold space for our students and for ourselves to get to those places where we have people around us who we can trust enough with the power of these stories to sit them down? And then finally, how does what I thought I knew about diverse Black people match what I'm now hearing from the engagements that I have with diverse Black people? Finally, and this is I think maybe the last slide, Black women offer up the need and example of living in the spirit of Black legacy. What I have found in this work with the Ghana Study Abroad was that different groups had different outcomes in their processes of remembering. For Black people in the Ghana Study Abroad, I'd characterize the work that they did as work of recovery as they were remembering, as being about repairing the spiritual, cultural, and material damages to ourselves and to our communities through engagement with African heritage and culture. Our work as Black teachers was about standing in the brilliance and strength of the legacy of Black people unabashedly, with no apologies and no permission needed. For many of my white students, their ability to live Black legacy in the spirit of being the co-conspirator that Dr. Love, Bettina Love, talks about could be characterized as an uncovering of the history and culture of Black people that they did not know, in some cases could not imagine. This included the hard work of acknowledging legacies of inhumanity wrought by their own ancestors. Their work was about developing a new covenant with their ancestors and thus with humanity, a new covenant, a new relationship that recognized the harm perpetrated against Black life and then actively worked to abolish and repair it in honor and struggle. It required active work towards justice versus simple acknowledgement of guilt or guilty feelings about the injustice. Living Black legacy requires that you be both able and willing to reclaim the legacy of Black and African people and take your place in living this legacy in the work of being a teacher. But living Black legacy necessarily requires risk, strength, and resilience, as well as joy and an Ubuntu spirit to do the work. It requires abolition and freedom dreaming. It requires that we work with every breath to show up whole. Regardless of the skin you are in, a fundamental test for all of us as teachers will be this. As we create lessons or programs or lectures, will diverse groups of Black people recognize your efforts to reclaim Black legacy? In other words, will Black people be able to see that your efforts are centered in Black humanity and legacy as Black people have experienced it, not just today, but for centuries? Here are a few last questions to consider as you begin your work in reclaiming and living Black legacy. What do Black stories mean to me, and what emotions and memories do they evoke? What are the structures in place, especially in schools, that have been and continue to be oppressive to Black people? How do I work diligently to tear them down and do my part to create sanctuary for those most harmed as we rebuild a structure of freedom for everybody? When somebody sees, this one seems maybe overarching, the most powerful. When someone sees my teaching work, how will they know, see, feel, experience that I have approached this particular work with reverence for Black lives, culture, and story? How will they know? These are some of the gifts that I think Black women teachers have given us, what I've learned through my work with groups of Black women teachers. But a gift is only a gift if the receiver accepts it in recognition that you have remembered us. But as Pamela Newkirk shares in her book about intimate letters from African Americans post-emancipation, the next slide. And if you don't have that book, those of you who teach literature, secondary literature, it's an incredible book of letters that Black folks wrote right after emancipation. And if you think about that, just sort of just on its face, these are Black folks who were not supposed to be learning to read and write. But yet this is a book of letters that they wrote back and forth to all kinds, to the church, to the pastor, to their friend, to the bakery person, whatever it might be. But they are incredible, so you should check it out. But this is what she says in her book. She said, a history of disparaging portrayals in popular culture has surely contributed to the reluctance by African Americans to expose our inner lives. This reticence poses a challenge for scholars who are seeking to depict the fullness of African American life and makes all the more precious the contributions that these letters make to these pages. I hope that my words have filled in a bit of that story. But who has more of the story to tell? As my student asked. My dear colleagues, teachers, you do. You have something to contribute to this greater story of remembering who we are together. I end with our legendary poet, Lucille Clifton, who is one of my favorites, and what she is calling us to do in her poem entitled, Why Some People Be Mad at Me Sometimes. She said, they ask me to remember, but they want me to remember their memories, and I keep on remembering mine. Remembering is where we must begin, and it's not optional for those of us who teach. It's essential, and so is education. Thank you for remembering so that we can all get free, and thank you for your kind attention. Thank you.